Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on War Thunder. This is a vehicular combat game developed and published by Gaijin Entertainment that was released into beta back in 2013, but it was released in full in 2016, and I've played it on and off for the better part of several years now. Steam says I've put about 46.3 hours into it, but it was actually a bit more than that because I started playing it before it was even on Steam. So the actual amount of time I put into it is probably closer to about 55 to 60 hours. I'm not exactly sure there, but suffice to say, I have been playing this game for a long time. I've seen a lot of changes over the course of its development. When I started playing it, it was just the air combat, and then they added the ground combat, and then eventually they also added naval combat. And out of the three, I played the ground combat the most. The naval combat I have barely played at all, and the air combat I have played a fair bit of, but it fell out of favor with me quite quickly. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment, but before I do that, I want to mention what this game actually is. It is similar to Wargaming's titles World of Tanks, World of Warplanes, and World of Warships in the sense that it is a vehicular combat game with some fairly heavy simulation elements to it, but unlike the three of those games, which are all individual games, this is all of that combined into one thing, and they have been continually updating it over the years, gradually adding new vehicles, and rebalancing previous vehicles as they continued. And while I'll talk a bit more about the business model later on, I do want to mention that this is nominally a free-to-play game in the sense that you don't have to pay anything to buy into the game, and there's no monthly subscription fees or anything like that. But for now, let's go ahead and start talking about the actual gameplay. So, like I said, the game is split into three modes: air combat, ground combat, and naval combat. I'm going to start with naval combat because I have the least to say about it. It's the mode I've put the least amount of time into for a few reasons that you'll understand in a moment, and it is the one I have the least progression in. I have not unlocked a single vehicle for it yet other than the starting vehicles. So admittedly, I have no idea what higher level play in the naval combat mode is like, but in the low battle rating category, which is something that you'll hear me reference a fair bit here, battle rating is basically the rough strength level of the vehicle that you're running at the moment. The combat basically just becomes a battle of attrition. You are ultimately competing over some points on the map, and whenever you capture a point, the enemy's point count will gradually decrease, sort of like in the Conquest mode in Battlefield, if you're familiar with that. And what ends up happening is the ships, which are fairly slow, will basically lumber into these points, and they will just shell and torpedo the living crap out of each other until eventually they sink, and you've got a few left standing. This takes quite a while. In fact, I've never been sunk thus far. I've certainly taken a lot of damage, but I haven't been outright sunk yet. I've gotten fairly close to it, but because the naval combat is rather imprecise, where you can't really target specific points on a ship all that well, and there's an awful lot of auto-targeting involved from your crew to where you basically just have to rely on the AI to actually hit things, it can be pretty messy to get in these naval engagements. As a result, I've found that the naval combat is very boring, although if you like naval combat circa World War II, then you might be able to get something out of it. But I've never really found naval combat all that interesting. Sure, the history of it is interesting, but as far as the various ships that you're using or the actual combat itself, I just don't really get much out of it. And considering the rather low amount of actual players that I have encountered while playing the naval combat, it seems like the majority of the community doesn't really care for the naval combat either. Although it may be that everybody's just playing on higher battle ratings, and thus I just can't get into matches with them because the people I'm playing with are all at the bottom of the progression tiers, and thus we haven't unlocked those higher battle rating ships yet. But hey, at least the naval combat fills in the mode with bots if there's not enough players, so there's that. Now then, let's go ahead and move on to the other modes. First being the air combat, which is the one I have the next least to say about, which may sound odd because that's the mode that's been in the game the longest, and the mode that I started playing. Now technically there are two types of air combat in the game. The first of them is the actual air battles where you are playing as various planes, and then the second one is helicopters which will go in up against the ground vehicles, but only in the higher tiers of the ground combat. I have not made it that far in the progression yet. You have to play a lot of the air battles to be able to get to the point where you can even unlock helicopters in the first place. Meanwhile, I have barely gotten up to the second tier of planes, so I'm nowhere near the ability to unlock the helicopters yet. So it's unfortunate, but I can't really talk about that style of gameplay. What I can talk about is the fixed-wing aircraft versus other fixed-wing aircraft. And to that end, you start the progression with biplanes, and you gradually work your way up through basically the planes that you would see during World War II, on up through the jets that you would find during the Cold War. And unlike the naval and ground battles where you'll have points on the map you need to control, the air battles, you can't really do that, so what they do instead is they will have various ground targets that need to be eliminated, and as you continue to eliminate those ground targets, the enemy's point count will drop, much like in the other two modes. And when one team's points have bottomed out, then the other team wins the match. You can also win the match by eliminating all of the players on the other team, but that's a bit more difficult to do by the time the game ends. As for the moment-to-moment gameplay, it's going to fall into one of two categories. Either you're going to be doing some dogfighting or other air support, or you are going to be attacking the ground targets. It's usually not much of an overlap, primarily because the fighters are really not geared towards attacking ground targets. They mostly just have machine guns or very light cannons that are not really capable of doing all that much damage to the more heavily armored ground targets. Actually flying all these various planes is actually a pretty straightforward and fairly easy process because the controls are actually surprisingly intuitive for keyboard and mouse controls. It does support flight sticks as well as gamepad, and from what I've seen it's perfectly playable on a gamepad. I haven't tried a flight stick yet. But with the way the targeting works, where you have a crosshair that you're pointing in the direction that you're trying to fly the plane to, and it will automatically turn and roll for you, and you're primarily using the keyboard to adjust the angle of the plane so you don't end up spiraling out of control or massively overloading on Gs, or just control the amount of throttle that you're using. It all actually ends up working out quite well once you get used to the controls. It's just a matter of getting used to them, which actually doesn't take all that long. It's just that since each plane handles differently, and some of them also have auto-targeting turret guns mounted on them, and some of them are very slow and lumbering, while others are fairly nimble and fast, it does have an adjustment period whenever you switch to a new plane. That said, you also need to be very careful when you get into dogfights because there are some more simulation aspects with the amount of damage your vehicles can take. So if you start getting into dogfights, you might find that they last only maybe 5 seconds before you've managed to hit something vital on an enemy plane, or they've hit something vital on yours and you just end up going down and needing to respawn. Or if you've run out of spawns, then you'll have to return to the hangar and queue up for another match. That said, if you can survive a dogfight and manage to get back to one of your friendly runways, then you might be able to land there and get some repairs for the plane, then just go right back out and go at it again. But that's easier said than done, because generally speaking, when you get into a dogfight, one of the planes is going to go down. Some of that comes down to trying to be more precise and deliberately target things that will take the enemy planes down rather than simply leave them limping, although in a lot of cases that would require you having some knowledge of what to specifically target on enemy planes, and not only that, just being rather good at the game, because getting any real precision out of the aircraft machine guns and such is actually pretty difficult in this. But if you are able to do it, then you might be scoring a whole lot of kills in the air combat mode. As you can no doubt tell from all of this footage, I am not good at the air combat mode. In fact, more often than not, I tend to find it rather boring, and the simple reason for that is that it takes a long time for your planes to get within engagement range, and by the time you do get into engagement range, you either need to be very skilled or very lucky to avoid being taken down within a few seconds and then having to respawn and start the entire process over again. And since I am neither lucky nor particularly skilled at this game, well, I would say you can imagine about how that goes when I get into engagement range, but you can see that from the gameplay footage. It doesn't go well. As such, unless I'm specifically playing the air combat mode with friends that do play War Thunder as well, I usually don't play the air combat mode in this all that much. I might hop in for a match or two every so often if I've even got the game installed at that point, and I usually don't enjoy it, so I just go back to what I do actually enjoy a fair bit when things are going well, which is the ground combat. Much like with the air combat's progression, you'll be starting out on various tanks and lightly armored vehicles that were basically around during the interwar period, and then throughout the progression you'll be gradually unlocking new tanks and armored vehicles, primarily from World War II, but eventually getting up to the Cold War era as well. And as a bit of an added bonus there, if you have ground support aircraft unlocked, or helicopters especially unlocked, then you'll be able to fly those vehicles during the ground combat missions as well. So the ground combat actually has a bit of combined arms going on, which is pretty cool. And the way the ground combat mode works is that you'll have two ways of achieving victory. Either you capture the points on the map and gradually drain the enemy's point count to 0, much like in the naval combat mode, or you eliminate all of the enemy vehicles. Unlike the extremely sluggish naval combat, however, you can actually move fairly quickly in the ground combat mode, depending on which vehicle you're driving. You won't be seeing a whole lot of quick movement in this particular video because I generally play tanks and tank destroyers, so I'm not really using any of the more lightly armored vehicles that are much quicker. Part of the reason for that is that you have to be very careful when you're in the lightly armored vehicles because pretty much anything can take you down. In fact, there are plenty of the lightly armored vehicles that can even be taken down by machine gun fire, let alone cannons. You see, armor is very important in the ground combat. Depending on where a shell impacts, it might completely bounce off of the armor, or it might do minimal damage, and the amount of damage you're going to take is going to be dependent on, of course, how much armor you have in general, just the sheer thickness of the plating, but also the angle of the plating and the angle that you are turned towards when the shell impacts your armor. And since all of the shots in this game are not hit scan, but rather are all projectiles, you're going to have to compensate for elevation and lead your targets to make sure that you are hitting a target in the right spot when the shell does eventually impact. You also need to be careful when you're going up against enemy tanks, because you need to make sure that you are angled in the right direction in order to be able to bounce shells more easily, and thus force the enemy to aim much more precisely and potentially make mistakes in order to be able to penetrate your armor. Of course, the more skilled players are going to be aware of that, and they're also going to be aware of where they need to put rounds in order to be able to penetrate the armor on the various tanks that they're going up against. And unlike with the aircraft, where you can basically hose them down with bullets and they'll go down without much fuss, the vehicles in the ground combat can actually be very resilient if they're angled properly and if their armor is thick enough. So you're going to get some pretty significant handling characteristic changes between vehicles. While the aircraft more or less have three basic playstyles depending on the general class of aircraft that you're flying, with the ground vehicles, not only do you need to be cognizant of the armor, but you also need to be cognizant of the power of your engine and the angles at which you can actually traverse the environment, because you can't go up too steep hills, and if you try to do that, then you'll end up getting yourself stuck. Thankfully, there are tow cables that can be used to help pull vehicles along if they get stuck, or if they can't necessarily make it up a certain steep hill, but another vehicle can, then they might be able to pull that vehicle along with them. Unless you can end up with more teamwork in the ground combat than you really can in the naval or air combat. That's obviously not to say that teamwork doesn't exist in either of those modes, it's just more readily apparent and more important in the ground combat mode. And you get a bit more flexibility with the way you play the ground vehicles versus the aircraft or the naval combat. If you're playing naval combat, you have basically two types of ships, and that's either a fast attack craft or a destroyer, and the destroyers are slow and lumbering, whereas the fast attack craft don't really have much in the way of firepower, but they are more nimble and quick. In the ground combat mode, on the other hand, you can play any number of ways. You can be very aggressive, get right into the thick of combat, and angle your plating to directly combat enemy vehicles. It's not really a good idea unless you have particularly good armor, but you can do it. And then there's also options of playing the more lightly armored vehicles and sneaking around enemy lines and hitting them from behind, either just to harass them or to spot them for your teammates, or even just to go around and capture the points before the enemy can get a chance to get there. You can also use the environment to your advantage, get yourself up into a pretty well camouflaged position and snipe at enemies from a long distance, or maybe take control of a strategic location and be able to rain down artillery barrages and shells upon your foes. It all contributes to the ground combat being more strategic, more skill-based, and frankly just more interesting than the air combat and especially the naval combat. But regardless of which mode you're playing, they all do have their moments. It's just that for me personally, ground combat tends to have much more of those moments than either of the other two. When those moments do roll around, the game can actually be quite a lot of fun. But then there's the elephant in the room, and the one thing that will prevent me from recommending this game to basically anybody, which is the business model. You see, this is a free-to-play game, which means that they have to monetize it some way. Particularly good free-to-play games would monetize the cosmetic stuff, so the skins, the decals, things like that. And they certainly do that here. The problem is that the in-game economy is not purely based on cosmetics. It's based on a lot of things and gets a bit convoluted. You see, there are 3 types of currency in this game. Silver Lions, which are the in-game currency that you earn by simply playing the game. The Golden Eagles, which are the premium currency that you spend real money for or very rarely can get as login bonuses. And War Bonds, which are earned by completing various tasks, and you can use them to purchase various premium vehicles or purchase boosters or universal backups, which will let you go right back into a battle using a vehicle that you just lost instead of having to wait until you go to another match to be able to use that vehicle again. For most of the things you'll be doing in the game, you'll be using the Silver Lions. These are used to purchase vehicles outright, to purchase crews to be able to use those vehicles, to train those crews to use additional vehicles, to purchase upgrades for your various vehicles as you gradually research them, and of course, to repair your vehicles if they took damage during battle. But you can't simply purchase a new vehicle to use whenever you have the currency for it. No. You have to research it first. You'll gradually earn research points as you play the game, and they will be applied to 2 things. The first of them is that you have upgrades that you can research for the various vehicles that you're already using, and then there's also the general research that you're currently working on in that particular category. So for example, with the ground battles, you'll select a vehicle that you're wanting to research, and then you'll also go into your various vehicle modifications, and you will select the upgrades that you want to research, and as you play, you will gradually earn research points towards those items. Once you've gotten enough research points to get an upgrade, then that upgrade will become available for purchase using Silver Lions, and then once you've bought that upgrade for the vehicle, it will give you some benefit, whether that be additional shell types available for your cannons, or maybe even giving you a smoke screen, or giving you the ability to call in artillery, or even just upgrades to the efficiency of whatever that particular part applies to. But once you've purchased that upgrade, it also increases the repair cost of your vehicle, so that's something else to keep in mind. But oh, we're not done yet. There are also convertible research points you'll earn as you continue to play, but you can't use those unless you spend Golden Eagles to convert them into actual research points. And then on top of all of that, your crews will also earn experience points, and as you continue to earn those, eventually you'll be able to spend them on upgrading the crew's efficiency in a wide variety of different areas. Now it is worth noting that in the case of the crew experience as well as the various vehicle modifications, the only ones that will have a significant impact on the way your vehicle plays are the ammunition types for your guns. All of the other upgrades are just incremental changes to the efficiency of your vehicle. They're not really the kind of thing you notice all that much. But the shell types for your cannons, for example, might make a very big difference. They might have very high penetration values, but have considerably less actual damage output, because usually the shells that have very high penetration values don't really have much else going on. They're just big, solid shot that just punches straight through the vehicle and keeps going. I mean, to give you some prime examples, there are shells that you can unlock for some of the vehicles that I'm using in the gameplay footage that you've been seeing, that will have very high armor penetration values compared to the default shells. but they require considerably more precision to be able to actually do anything effective with, because instead of penetrating the armor and then spraying shrapnel all throughout the cabin of the vehicle, they just penetrate the armor and keep going as one solid shot. As a result, using the default shell that you start with is actually much more effective with those particular vehicles, because then it will penetrate the armor, it will spray shrapnel throughout, and if you eliminate the crew of the enemy vehicle, then you've taken them out and you don't need to worry about it. Now sure, there are certain shells that you have to unlock that more or less take a vehicle that is garbage and turn it into something really effective, but those are really the exception rather than the norm. There are also a few modifications that will give the tank a bit of extra armor in certain places, but it's usually not enough to make that much of a difference. So at first, given the business model of the game and the fact that so many free-to-play games fall into the pay-to-win trap, you might think that the upgrades to the vehicles, and especially the premium vehicles, would be completely overpowered compared to all the other stuff, but they actually aren't. The premium vehicles in particular are basically just alternate versions of existing vehicles, or they might be captured enemy vehicles that are being used in a different faction, or maybe a weird prototype vehicle that didn't actually see action but is really no better or worse than any of the other tanks out there, or things along those lines. You can certainly play through the entire game without spending any real money at all. It's just going to be an extremely long, extremely tedious grind for you to do that. Think about it this way. All of the time I have put into this game, almost all of which was spent in the ground combat mode, has resulted in me only getting to the 3rd tier of tanks, out of 6 by the way, during the process of me recording footage for this video. Prior to that, I barely got to the 2nd tier of air vehicles. And here's the thing, this is all simply for one faction, out of 9. There are 9 factions in this game, each with their own research trees, each of which requires you to grind your way through to get to any of the really good stuff. And to make matters worse, you earn research points at a reduced rate if you are playing in a higher or lower tier of vehicles than the vehicle that you're currently researching. And while the moment-to-moment gameplay can certainly be enjoyable and that helps to offset the grind, unfortunately the matchmaking can be a bit iffy sometimes, and it will throw you into matches where you've been up BR'd, which means that you're going up against vehicles with a higher battle rating than your own, and thus you're at a disadvantage. A lot of that just depends on who's in the matchmaking queue at any given point and what they've got set up for their various vehicle crews, but regardless, if you're getting thrown into a higher battle rating than what your vehicles are, then you're going to be finding enemies have thicker armor and you're going to need to aim for soft spots a lot more. And while you're not necessarily going to lose immediately because you've been thrown into a higher battle rating, it does make things a lot more difficult for you. And obviously, if you're losing a lot of battles, whether it be because you're being up BR'd or just being outplayed or whatever, then the costs and silver lions are going to add up, and eventually you're going to start running into monetary problems, unless of course you've managed to build up a good cushion. Of course, those cushions tend to be eliminated when you go to buy new vehicles because the vehicles are very, very expensive. And between the painfully slow rate of research point acquisition and the iffy rate of Silver Lion acquisition, it makes it pretty painfully obvious they are trying to push you in the direction of paying for the premium service, which will give you increased rates of all of that, or paying for the Golden Eagles so you can spend them on premium vehicles or things along those lines. It's a situation where you can understand why they're doing this thing. It's because it's a free-to-play game and they gotta make their money somewhere, but the funny part about that is that where most games would have you pay to skip the grind, here you can't even really do that. You're paying to accelerate the grind. And while on the one hand that does mean it is more fair to the free players who are not spending any money, who are having to grind all of this out, on the other hand this actually screws over the people who have more money than they have time. So you end up with a game that has an extremely tedious grind no matter what you do, and that means the only people who are going to be able to get much out of this game are the people who can put up with that grind, who can enjoy the gameplay enough to be able to put up with that grind. And that's something I can only do in very short bursts. Because I'll look through the research trees and see vehicles, I'm like, ooh, I really want to give that vehicle a try, or I want to give that vehicle a try. But then I realized, oh wait, it's going to take me probably 10 plus hours of grinding to get to that point. Do I really want to put up with that? And most times the answer is absolutely friggin' not, because I simply don't have the time for it. And even if I could skip the grind by paying, I don't really have the money for that either. I might be able to make a purchase here or there, but it's not going to be something I'll be able to constantly pump money into to skip the grind on stuff. And frankly, the money I would be spending on War Thunder, I would rather be spending on other games that I can cover on the channel that might be considerably more interesting. And thus we have the central dilemma of War Thunder. The amount of vehicles in the game is kind of insane, actually. There are a ton of them, and you're bound to find something that you'll find interesting in it. New vehicles are constantly being added, and existing vehicles are constantly being rebalanced to make sure that they don't fall into the wrong battle rating and don't go up against things that they really shouldn't be going up against. The game's got pretty good graphics, it runs really well, it plays well, and those simulation aspects are really cool. The moment-to-moment gameplay of War Thunder can be very enjoyable. But the fact that it's a free-to-play game and the business model they've gone with is such a ridiculously tedious grind means that the only people who can really get the most out of the game are the kind of people who both enjoy the gameplay mechanics and those who can put up with that ridiculous grind. And if you happen to be one of those people, then maybe give War Thunder a shot. I mean, it is free to play, you can give it a try. If you like the gameplay, then maybe you stick with it. But if you know you're not going to be able to put up with that grind, then you might as well just avoid War Thunder entirely. Those of you who might be on the fence about it, well, to be fair, the game is free to play, so if you want to give it a try, then you're not really losing anything by giving it a try. I just want you to know what you're getting yourself into if you do give it a try. Because I wasn't really sure what I was getting myself into when I started playing War Thunder all those years ago. And while I don't necessarily regret playing War Thunder, because again, the moment-to-moment gameplay has been pretty enjoyable from time to time, I probably would have saved myself a lot of frustration with the grind if I hadn't given it a try. But as it stands though, War Thunder has become a game where I only play it if I'm really in the mood to play a tank game, and that doesn't really happen all that often. But if after all of that you're still interested in giving War Thunder a try, I'll have a link in the video description box to where you can grab it on Steam and try it out for yourself. Just be aware what you're getting yourself into on this one. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or replacing broken equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to do that or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.